You're looking at the Mona Lisa. It's simply one of the most well-known and famous paintings from the Renaissance. It's, of course, painted by Leonardo da Vinci in the first decade of the 16th century, the very height of the Renaissance, and in many ways this particular painting comes to epitomize what the Renaissance was all about. So while I talk about the Renaissance this morning, you could sit at your computer and stare at the Mona Lisa and have her stare back at you while you're listening to me. From a chronological point of view, it's difficult to put precise dates on the beginning and end of the Renaissance, but that's what we do as historians, and so let's just keep it easy for our sake of convenience. Let's just say 1400, start of the 15th century, 1400 as the beginning of the Renaissance, and let's say 1600 as the end of the Renaissance. We could be more precise and say 1450 to 1550, and that really dates 1500 as the very middle, the height of the Renaissance. And so what was the Renaissance? The Renaissance was an intellectual movement, a rebirth, a reawakening of all things dealing with the ancient world, with the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, and more specifically, all things dealing with humanity. Many scholars point to the key part of the intellectual movement of the Renaissance as something which we call humanism, focus on humanity as opposed to the focus on the afterlife or the soul or the religious nature of man. Traditionally, the humanists were interested in studying human nature and human values and the importance of humanity. Really, if you look at the Middle Ages and the importance where the church dominated thinking and intellectual thought, the church's view was that man was basically, by his very nature, evil. The Renaissance, the humanists shifted that away and found that man, there was goodness in man. Man could be perfected, that man had dignity, and so that man was worthy of study. The shift from man being evil, the focus on God, to the focus on man himself is an important characteristic of the Renaissance. The Renaissance primarily took place in Italy and northern Italy. It spread throughout Western Europe and reaching different countries at different periods of times. But Italy was really the center of what we know of the Renaissance. And that's because clearly Italy was the location where the Roman Empire was. It was the closest thing to Rome, and so if intellectuals are looking back to the writings of the ancients, the writing of the classics, to the Roman Republic, and actually to Greece also, then the area most closely connected to that was undoubtedly Italy, and that was going to benefit and become part of this focus on the Renaissance. The Renaissance is also connected to the rise of trade, the appearance of the middle class trading network, which had expanded throughout the 15th century. And as that expanded, this new middle class had money, and they had money with which to patronize the arts. And so they did. And so art became one of the most important forms of the Renaissance. We study the Renaissance, we often focus on the important individuals of the Renaissance. People like Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, who lived in the 14th century, a little bit before our date of 1400. Petrarch, often called the father of the Renaissance for his literary works, his sonnet Giovanni Boccaccio, again, the 14th century, a little bit before our 1400 time period, published the Decameron, Machiavelli, which you can always read. And then there were the artists. Without question, the Renaissance is most closely connected with art and innovations in art, the new focus on technique of the artists. And so the real key figures in the art world in the Renaissance are, of course, Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, Raphael, 1483 to 1530, and then Michelangelo, 1475 to 1564. All three of these artists working in Italy focused on secular images, secular depictions, and the Mona Lisa is there is no better example of that. The focus on the human form. Again, the Mona Lisa is a great example of that. Perspective in the paintings, the depth of paintings, the chiaroscuro, the contrast between light and darkness in the paintings, and a revolt against the flatness and religiosity of the medieval world. It set Western art on a different course, and what the artists were accomplishing to focus on the portrait of man, the individuality of man, was emblematic of the entire Renaissance. So it's kind of weird. I sat down to to talk about the Renaissance in just a couple of minutes. This is something I've done a lot as I've taught Western Civ over the years. It's difficult. Increasingly, I find this idea of the Renaissance, and by the way, the term Renaissance itself is a 19th century creation. Historians of the 19th century looked back at this period of time and saw it as a marvelous period of time, an innovative period of time, an awakening of period of time, and with the connection back to the classical world. That's why it was called a rebirth, the reconnection back to the writings of the classical world, where the classical writers, the classical artists focused on humanity. If you think about statues of ancient Greece, the Discobolus, the discus thrower, for the ancient Greeks, the human form, the human body, that was the center of their artistic and intellectual world. That was very, very important to them. And the intervening centuries of Christianity had downplayed the importance of the physical form of man, downplayed the worth of man with the idea that man was necessarily evil and had to be saved by Christianity. And so only with the Renaissance, 1500 years later or so, that there is again a refocus on the importance of man and the dignity of man and the human form. And so that's what the 19th century historians found really important. And so that's why they called it the rebirth, the Renaissance period. But as you think about that today, it's really difficult to put your hands around the Renaissance because it's such an amorphous movement. You can't really exactly say when it started. Did it start 1400? Did it start 1314? Did it end in 1564 with the death of Michelangelo? I hope that's his death date. Did it end in 1600? The boundaries are so fluid, and in actuality, the characteristics of the movement are so fluid also, because even though the Renaissance was so focused on the human form, some of the most important works of the Renaissance period are religious in nature. And you're thinking of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, you're thinking of Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel. But there's a distinction, even though those are still religious focused works of the Renaissance period. The depiction of man in those works is so much different than the way man was depicted in the medieval period of time in religious works. I hope what I've said about the Renaissance, some of what I said, makes sense and helps you understand the general characteristics and boundaries of what is the Renaissance. Okay, thanks.